Hello and welcome to the Remaining Sane, Finding Peace in Our Chaos podcast, a podcast about both theology and police work. I'm your host, Will. Today, I have on as a guest my good friend and longtime police officer, Mr. Ken Palmer. Ken, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Will.
Good. So, just to start, you mind go ahead and tell us what's your law enforcement background?
I went into law enforcement when I was 21 years old. I went to work with a Metro Atlanta Police Department in 1968 and stayed with them until 1974. And I decided to take a break, and I moved to a fire department. At that time, the time with the Metro, it was actually the DeKalb County Police outside of Atlanta. During that time, I found it difficult to deal with the everyday. Of course, 68 through 74 was a different time for our country and everything else. And I was doing it with no sense of spirituality at all. I had really moved away, like a lot of teenagers do, or young people. I moved away from God at a very early age.
Did you grow up in the church, or?
Yeah, I actually grew up in an Episcopal church, and because of my events in my family, when I was 13, I turned completely away from God, and found myself with the police department without any kind of spiritual support or guidance in my life. Found it very hard to deal with.
What led you to be a police officer?
Mistake. No, I came out of the military, been in the Air Force, and came home with absolutely no idea of what I was going to do. And I grew up in an area around Avondale Estates, outside of Atlanta. And I knew the police chief, and we ran into each other one day, and he asked me what I was going to be doing. And I told him I had no idea, and he told me to get in the car. So I thought he was going to take me to jail. And he took me down to the police department there at DeKalb County and went in, introduced me to the chief of police, and we talked for about 15 minutes, and the chief said, how would you like to come to work with us? And I said, okay. He said, well, can you be here at 11:30 tonight? And I started my first shift. Of course, law enforcement was very different in that era as far as training concerned. I never got to an academy until I was already about 6 months into my police career.
Yeah. So you had, done calls, been to people shot, all this kind of crazy stuff without any training at all, right?
Oh, I'd been shot.
Oh, you?
I got shot the 6th week on duty, but so yeah, I'd been there. And
well, what's that story? I'm curious.
I was riding with my training officer, and we were on I-85, right off of I-85 in Atlanta, and got a call to a armed robbery at a motel called the Golfland Motel. And we happened to be about maybe 400 yards from it. And we went down the access road, got out of the car. Each of us grabbed a shotgun, and it had one of those drive-through porticos. And I'm left-handed. My partner was right-handed. And we both went to the wrong side of the wall. So when the two subjects came out of the building, we confronted them and told them to drop their weapons. They didn't, and they fired. we fired back, and when I kind of being left-handed stepped out behind the wall, I was exposed, and I got hit. But the thing was, I didn't know I was hit. I was 5 minutes into it. We had already checked the subjects, and we're walking back to the car when my partner said, "Hey, Ken, that guy bled all over your pants." And I looked down and realized I was shot, and I immediately hit the ground at that time.
Yeah. So there was no like flash of your life between your eyes, or it was just kind of the adrenaline got rid of the feeling, right?
Yeah, it never. I was 21, dumb, and thought I was bulletproof, and that almost convinced me that I was not bulletproof. It was later on in my career when I lost my partner on duty that I realized that this job can get you killed.
Yeah.
And up until that point, it had been just fun and games. And then the reality of the job set in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, that's something that personally I haven't lost a partner on duty, but, just recently we had someone from our department die that I knew. That has kind of changed my outlook on some stuff because, you realize that there are, real world ramifications for this job around you, right? Like, that's one of the things that makes this job a little bit different than a lot of other jobs. The worst thing that you can do professionally as, let's say, a realtor is maybe you really make a client upset about a house. You weren't nice to them. You arrived late. They weren't happy. And so they, filed a complaint on you and this, that, and the other, X, Y, and Z, right? You had a bad day, you messed up, whatever. You have a bad day and you mess up as a police officer, you can end up either in dead or in prison or, just the ramifications are, I believe, a lot greater in this job. Now, don't get me wrong, there are other jobs where the first job that comes to mind where you can really mess up bad and it go really poorly for you is a firefighter, and then to a lesser extent like an attorney. Like you mess up somebody's money or their case and you end up getting disbarred and losing a bunch of money, maybe even going to jail for a little bit. But that we live in the real world, right? And that's something that I've learned so quickly, is that this job gives you a PhD in common sense very, very quickly.
Well, with no common sense, you won't last in this job.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that go on with you in this job that you don't realize that stay with you the rest of your life. I've been retired for 8 years now. 8 years, in about 2 months it'll be 8 years. And it was a mentality that you get as a police officer, that you're not going to die. I never walked out of the house and put on a badge and put on a gun and walked out the door thinking I was going to die. And that is because if you do, you won't be able to walk out the door. And that's the thing that stays with you. If you do this job long enough, it stays with you all your life. It wasn't but 3 years ago, 5 years after my retirement, I had a heart attack and ended up having 6 bypasses. It never occurred to me that might kill me until I was having a conversation with my surgeon afterwards, and he was talking about how I had asked about damage to the heart muscle, and he said, well, Ken, he said, when I had your heart out and I was looking, and it struck me at that point that he had actually taken my heart out of my body. And I went, you could have died. And so, but that is the mentality we as police officers, and I still consider myself that, as we as police officers build up in our mind. And it's a dangerous thing. And there's so many inherent dangers in being a police officer over long periods of time that is, and I can say this for firefighters too, do it for a long period of time. We tend to compartmentalize things in our brain. We see so much nasty stuff on the job that you can't live with it daily, so you unconsciously or consciously take that incident and just kind of put it in a little box in your brain and say, I'll think about that later. Unfortunately, with us in law enforcement, a lot of times we don't think about it later, and it leads to some bad things.
Yeah, and it just pops up. Like I've got a few calls that I can think of that, you know, I see someone that reminds me of X, Y, and Z person that was out on. I'll give a real good example. So the first kid call that I had, it was a 12-year-old girl, and their family only spoke Spanish, so I had to come out of sector because I was translating or interpreting for the family. The family did not know that this girl was diabetic, and apparently puberty affects your insulin. I'm not sure about this at all, but it can almost kind of awaken. You become way more susceptible to your diabetes as you go through puberty. Well, this girl was 12 years old going through puberty, and she had eaten something, or the family had never realized ever that she was diabetic. And so she unfortunately ended up dying on the spot. They had some kind of crazy diabetic attack, and they didn't know what happened. And they called 911 too late, and the girl died. And I remember showing up and, you know, seeing CPR being done on a 12-year-old who's just sitting there lifeless on the ground. That has never gone away. And so sometimes when I see people that, or see houses that remind me of that, like I'll think of that. And, you know, that stuff like that, unfortunately, is the burden that we, with this vocation, bear, right? Like, you know, we're the protectors of society, but one of the bad problems is that not only do we protect people physically, but we also shield them from some of the really bad stuff that happens, so they don't have to see or smell or touch those images, right? Well, Ken, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, I interrupted you after you said you had 7 years on the job at DeKalb County. What happened after that to lead you to more police?
Well, I'd been shot. I'd been stabbed. I'd had my skull fractured. And I thought I'd find a safer profession, so I went into the fire service. And I was in the fire service from 1974 to 1978. And it was while I was in the fire service that I developed a interest in fire investigations. And so in 1978, and it was during this time with the fire department that there was a fireman and his wife that I worked with led me back to Christ. And that was a very important time in my life because everything changed at that point. In 1978, I decided that I needed to go back to school. And I was very fortunate to I had a wife and 2 kids, and I had a wife that said, go. And so I went and ended up graduating from Mercer University and with a double major of biblical studies and history. After that, I was offered a scholarship to Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary to pursue a degree in theology. And I took that scholarship. And during that period of time, I was working in churches during college and during seminary. But it was during seminary that I found out that I was not a Baptist. I got very much in touch with and curious about worship, and my old background as a child as an Episcopalian came back for that love of a liturgical worship type service, and so when I came out, I pastored for a year and decided I just was not going to be able to do that. Yeah. So I left and we came back to Georgia. And a friend of mine that I'd worked with the fire department was now working with the state fire marshal's office. And we were talking. He said, "Why don't you come to work with us at the fire marshal's office till you decide what you want to do?" And 33 years later, I retired from there. Because of my law enforcement background, when I went with the state fire marshal's office, I became part of the state arson investigation unit in Georgia. All those investigators had to be certified firefighters plus certified police officers, and I was grandfathered in on my police officer certification. So I was capable of taking that job, and then later on in my career became captain of the field operations for the state fire marshal's office arson investigation unit. And that's where I completed my law enforcement career.
Yeah. So one of the things that we haven't dug into yet is that we've talked a lot about patrol, right? Patrol responding on scene to stuff that's happening right then and there, and those experiences. But we haven't really delved into investigations, which is a different side of law enforcement. And so for the people that are maybe not necessarily cops, what I'm saying is that there are, as we all know, there's police officers, but also there's detectives, right?
Right.
All detectives are police officers. Not all police officers are detectives. So detectives, sometimes you joke with them and say that they're second responders, right?
Right.
They'll show up after a crime has occurred. 9 out of 10 times it's for a major crime where you need someone to do multiple days of investigation to figure the crime out. And so you'd done 7 years on the street and then been a firefighter for a little bit, responding on the street to fires. And then you move into investigations after going to seminary.
Right.
Yeah. So what are some of the mental tolls that investigations take on you that maybe patrol doesn't, or are there? You understand what I'm saying?
The people who live in our area, the Southeast, a lot of times have been referred to as the Bible Belt. But it's also referred to as the Burn Belt. We have more arson fires in the Southeast than in probably any other place in the country. And in this northwest Georgia, Chattanooga area, more arson fires than anywhere else. So there's a lot of fires, but a lot of people don't understand the number of deaths that you have to deal with. I know in our case in Georgia, the body of anyone who died in a fire was to stay on the scene until we got there. and work with the coroner to start our investigation with the body on scene, if at all possible. And it's those fire deaths that stay with you for a long time. A lot of times during my career with the fire marshal's office, you'd work 75 to 80 fire deaths a year. When I became captain of the unit, one of my responsibilities in field operation was I went to all fire fatalities that our unit was involved in. You mentioned children. It's not to minimize any life. All life is precious. But when you go to a fire scene to do your investigation and there is a child or children involved, those cases eat at your heart, eat at your mind, eat at your soul, and they don't go away. Particularly when you find out that this fire was intentionally set. One case comes to mind that happened in Middle Georgia. Went to a scene in a trailer park where we had 4 children had died. Miraculously, the father and his girlfriend got out. And as we were conducting the investigation, it was obvious that it was a set fire. And then we found out that the father had put the children in this one bedroom. They were aging 2 to 6 years old. Had put the children in the bedroom, set the room on fire, and then held the door closed. Those things stay with you, and those things can make you not want to be a police officer and just make you want to be a human being who can act out, and you can't.
That is something also that I know is very frustrating. I've been to a case, not really that drastic, but I've been to this case. Long story short, a homeless guy sexually assaulted a 6-year-old in her own bed, and he broke in, and so especially now where the guy is getting not near as much prison as he needs. Stuff like that really eats at you because you see injustice in front of you and you want to make it right.
Yeah, see, a lot of people don't believe in evil. And that day when I was sitting in the interrogation room with this man who had killed his own children for a totally frivolous reason that we don't need to get into. But looking in this man's eyes, I could see evil in this man's eyes. This man had no conscience, and he had no empathy at all or remorse at all for what he had done. And those are the times that if you're a police officer and you have no spiritual awareness, you have no Christianity, those are the days that will drive you into a lane that you don't want to be. Those are the days that for me as a Christian that I had to leave the room and spend some time asking God to give me the strength and asking God to give me the courage to continue that interview without letting my inner self come out too badly there.
That is something that I've really wanted to focus on. As you know, this podcast is based on the hypothesis that if you do this job for long enough, you're going to become cynical, nihilistic, or a substance abuser. And when I say substance abuser, once again, it's not just physical substances like medication or alcohol, but even stuff that releases a lot of dopamine. So fornication or video games, that you're going to become addicted to that. And eventually that's going to drive you down, a pit of depression, right? We all know that. And if you don't have Christ, then you cannot avoid that. If you do this job long enough, that's my goal with all this. And it seems like you're a really good example of this, right? Because you did this job 7 years, no spiritual background at all,
right?
Or rather, you had a little bit of a background, but you weren't. Didn't care about Christ, didn't care about God. Maybe just kind of knew God existed, but it didn't care, right? Am I putting words in your mouth?
I think because of what had happened to me as a child, as far as my spirituality was concerned, I would acknowledge that there may be a God, but I didn't want any part of it or Him. And I didn't want any part of that in my life. And of course, during that first 7 years, it led to excessive drinking. It led to a mindset that I was a entity in my own, that anything that happened was my own doing and what I did, and that's the way I liked it. Once I became a Christian and went back into law enforcement, I think that's when I realized how bad that first 7 years was. And you know as well as I do that, if we look at retired police officers and look at them who have done the job for 20, 25, 30, in my case, 40 years, you find a large majority end up eating their gun after they retire. And that's because they have no hope. All of that stuff that we do every day as a law enforcement officer builds up and comes back to us. And if you don't have a good spiritual background to fall back on, you're not going to survive it.
That's something that one of the previous guests on my podcast put up. It's one of the things he said is that his purpose for this world is not this job, but this job does contribute to his purpose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we mean by that is that you cannot make this job the reason for which you exist. And if you do that, even retired police officers who have full pension and everything just have to sit down, watch and drink beer and watch TV and getting a paycheck, or will end up eating their gun or doing something. Once again, another reference to Danny Jones, doing career suicide, doing something that's going to maybe put their pension in doubt or mess up their marriage and without Christ being your purpose, then everything else is fleeting, right?
Right.
This is something that I've really been reading in Ecclesiastes recently. Even noble things, I think that police work is very much a noble thing. If you continue to pursue that as the reason for which you exist, even that is going to consume you. Even if you're trying to do the most noble things, because eventually we grow old. Eventually we can't do this job, even if we've done it 40 years, right? And we can't make this job our end goal, because at the end of the day, what remains is heaven, not this world, right? I can't remember who said this. There's an Orthodox monk who's quoted as saying, "I have never been happy in this world," or no, I have never been joyful in this world, because he knows what lies beyond, right? I think with that, we're going to take just a quick break. Alrighty, and we're back.
Okay. I'd like to touch on something that you said right before we took the break about the job. I know my last part of law enforcement was all done when I was a believing Christian, when I was active in the churches. And what you said reminded me of this time 8 years ago. It was during the summer, and I was sitting on the back porch about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning by myself, the way I normally did, because that's when I normally worked. But I got to thinking about this retirement thing, and I had to ask myself the question. I did, and I asked myself, is this job what I do, or is this job who I am? And it really worried me, to be honest with you, that it was who I was. And after I did retire, several months later, I realized, nope, it was just a job.
Thank God.
Yeah, thank God, because it would really have been a bad thing. And I think too many people in law enforcement do retire, and it turns out that the job was who they were. They didn't have anything else to fall back on. And when the job went away, their purpose went away. I was fortunate enough that I found and had another purpose, and I was able to put more time into serving the church, serving God. When the opportunity came up to talk with you before you went into the police department, and been able to talk to you since you have been a police officer, has given me another purpose. Yeah. And so it's a matter of searching for that purpose and having that purpose. And without God, a retired police officer have a hard time dealing with life in general.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I touched on with Dr. Mitchell is that this job, because it is so embodied, right? Like we have our vestments, our uniform, we have our badge, we have, we actually do good things in the world. That it's easy to form a religion out of it, right?
Right.
Because, as the priest is the intercessor between the laity and God, we become the intercessor between the public and the evil. So it's easy to form this pseudo religion out of police work, and then you find guys that all they do is find their purpose in this job, and I don't hate to say it that this is not the reason for which you should exist. There are greater things beyond this, and you've done this job for a long time, and let's say that we're there. Let's say that I am someone who, all I do is think about police work, how to make the next arrest, how to go about doing X, Y, Z with the job. What are some small steps that you can take to get away from that?
The first thing you have to do is tell them to set down their beer and let's talk. And let the officer tell you about his experience as a police officer. And then start to let him know that there is a greater thing. That, yes, you are a police officer. And yes, your job is vital to society. I know it's a cliche. The thin blue line that stands between order and chaos. And that is the police officer. But it is not the end all. That there has to be something in your life other than that will allow you to do that job and to do it correctly. God gave me the ability to do the job. God gave me the ability to survive the job emotionally, spiritually. And I think you're very, very much on point where a lot of times we would want to make the job our religion. Make the job something that we worship. And I don't think that's different from a lot of other professions, and to tell you the truth, because there's a lot of folks out there that their God is the money. Yeah. And so, but for the police officer, they're looked to or by society as that order keeper. And then you start to feel like, okay, well, maybe we are God.
Yeah. And that's another fault to make too. Yeah, that's something.
And when you get to that point of thinking we are God, that's when we start getting in trouble. That's when we start drawing our own lines. And I think that's much easier to do if you have nothing else to fall back on. If you don't have a good marriage, if you don't have a strong family identity, if you don't have God to fall back on, you're going to find yourself flopping around out there in the breeze.
That's something that I'm very thankful for, is that we have family in town. We have a really good church in town, as you and I both know.
Yep.
We have even outside of that, we've got a good support system here. I've got friends from outside police work and outside of church that are in this area. And so that's helped me when I need to just not do this, right? Ken, one of the things that I wanted to touch on is that I've actually gotten a couple questions from people that I've been testing this podcast with, and that is what are some of the either spiritual or even physical practices that we can do to help center ourselves on Christ and not center ourselves, just solely on police work, right? Or if we're in a call or we're in a situation where, oh man, we need something to get ourselves out of this. And I want to really open this question up. It can be practices that you have in your marriage to keep the marriage going. It can be practices you have to keep the relationship with your kids open. And I really want to make this open. So, everything from crossing yourself to, what are a couple of things that you've done?
Well, there's nothing more orthodox in the Anglican religion denomination than an ex-Baptist. Of course, we are a liturgical worship. And so it's not a matter of sitting and listening, hopefully listening to what's going on in the service. Our services are interactive. You can't just sit there. And there are things during the service that are very meaningful for me. Bowing to the cross. Bowing to the name of Jesus. Kneeling when I pray. Crossing myself. These are things that are outward signs. And when I do these things outwardly, what I'm doing is I'm teaching my heart and my mind to bow to Christ, to kneel before the cross.
To submit oneself to Christ.
To submit oneself to Christ. And sometimes you find that there's some people that are just too darn proud to do that. And they won't. And like I say, I'm very orthodox. I'm probably more orthodox than 70, 80% of the people in our particular congregation. But it helps me to relate to Christ and the worship service. Finding prayer, daily prayer, not just on Sunday, but daily prayer helps. I think that everyone needs to find a time during their day to pray, to take some time and submit themselves, and to take some time to admit to God that I need help. Whether you do it with a devotional or, in my case, as an Anglican, with the Book of Common Prayer, I have daily offices that can be said 3 times a day. And that helps me and anchors me in this life that I'm living.
Not to beat a dead horse, because I've mentioned this a couple times, but confession of sin, this is the practice of vocalizing sin to someone else, is huge, I think, for me, because there's something powerful about not only telling God directly, but also saying it to someone in front of you, because it helps embody. I've had a couple questions about this, but a priest is not God. He is the intercessor between God and laity, right? And so when I vocalize my confession of sin to a priest, I am saying to God through him how I've messed up. And I think that's powerful, because we're not just in our head, right? Like, we know this as police officers, that the way that we interact with the world is not just through our brains. Mm-hmm. We with our hands and with our feet. We feel, physical pain on the job. we see people suffering, and we smell it, we touch it, right? And so that I think it's important to have all the senses in your faith, right? So that because the way in which we interact with the world is very physical. Our faith needs to be that way as well, because that is the most. If we are destined for heaven, then that's going to be a physical reality, not just a mental one, right?
Right.
And so, and hopefully it helps remind us of that eventually there is a place beyond here, because as Jefferson says, two things are certain in life: death and taxes.
There
right?
you go. You mentioned something there about the senses, and that was one thing that, like I said, when I was in seminary, I got really interested in studying worship. And like I say, that's when I found out I wasn't a Baptist. But because I was looking for a worship experience that it incorporated all of my senses. I didn't want to just go to a worship service and hear. I wanted to see it. I wanted to smell it. I wanted to taste it. I wanted for it to be a physical experience. And I found that in our liturgy. And what was important, what you said, I think, is there's a need for confession on a personal level, and there's also a need for confession on a corporate level. I know in our liturgy during our confession, it starts off, we have sinned. Yeah, we have violated this trust. We have violated these laws. And by what we have done and left undone. And so that's an important part of healing yourself spiritually. The hardest part for a non-Christian becoming a Christian is being able to say, I have sinned and I need help. And for a police officer, it's doubly hard to say, I need help.
That is something that I've heard over and over and over from people, is that for a police officer, it's extremely hard to admit you need help, because we're used to being taught that you need to be able to handle everything by yourself. I've been told that in police academy and out in my own, especially the area that I work, we're so separated out. I have worked calls that I had no business working by myself. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that because we do need help. We need help from our brothers and sisters around us, from our priests who are our fathers, and from Father God Himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ken, we're about to wrap up, but there's one thing that hopefully we can end up on a lighter note.
Okay.
I want to ask you, Ken. You've done this job for a long, long time. What is the just wildest, craziest story that you have?
Good grief, the wildest, craziest. My first patrol car was a 1968 Plymouth Roadrunner with a 440 Hemi engine in it. And at the time, DeKalb County was dry. Atlanta was wet. And so a lot of times on 2 or 3 o'clock on a Friday or a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning, we would sit at the line, the county line, and wait for the people to come out of Atlanta. And we were sitting, I was driving this time, and my partner, Steve, was with me. And this Firebird 400 came underneath the interstate bridge that we were sitting on, and it was on at that point. By the time we got behind him, we had exceeded 130 miles an hour. We were chasing him northbound on 85, and I remember dispatch coming on. We had told them that we had crossed into Gwinnett County, and they told us to break off the chase, let DeKalb County Georgia State Patrol take over. Well, my partner, being who he was, just took his left foot and kicked the radio out from underneath the dashboard, and so we were no longer in communications. The chase lasted. We went through 3 roadblocks. We jumped the median twice. We jumped a ramp once. Georgia State Patrol said that when we passed them at one point, one of their units had clocked us at 147. And we were going northbound, and we continued going northbound. 2 state trooper cars got wrecked in this thing, and we were a quarter of a mile from the South Carolina state line when he finally dropped a piston, and the chase ended. And I had been telling my partner the whole time, and a different time, different era, I kept telling my partner, I said, when we get this guy stopped, I'm just going to beat the ever-loving daylights out of him. And he finally stopped. I pulled over and started to step out of the car, and my legs wouldn't hold me up, and I actually fell to the ground. And this character actually told us, he said, well, if I'd have made it to the South Carolina state line, which was Lake Hartwell Bridge, he said, I'd have been home free. And this Georgia State trooper snatched him up and put him in the car, and he said, let me show you home free. And we drove up to the South Carolina state line, and there were 15 South Carolina state troopers sitting on the bridge, northbound and southbound, with all lanes blocked. There was no way to get through. He said the only way you'd have got across that river, son, was if you were swimming. And that was a crazy chase.
Yeah.
That was a crazy chase. And my car was a total wreck.
Yeah, I can imagine.
My car was a total wreck by the time it was over, because of the frame had twisted and the windows had popped out, and it was fun, to be honest with you. But it was fun. It was scary, and like they always say, the good guys won.
Yeah. With that, we're going to end, but thank you for coming on. And for those of you who have any follow-up or any questions, remember you can email remainingsanepodcast@gmail.com. Once again, that's remainingsanepodcast@gmail.com, or find us at Twitter at remainingsanepc. This has been the Remaining Sane Finding Peace in Our Chaos podcast. Have a blessed rest of your day.